Hello and welcome to Dynamic DCUO. Valmy here, and what I want to talk to you guys about today is water. I'm going to use Faye Siren, my villain water character. She's only level 271, doesn't have a ton of skill points, but I want to show you the difference between running with and without the high tide. And the first loadout I'm going to do is without high tide, starting with Drown, then going with water spouts, which is a fun little control power, ebb and flow, the tsunami strikes, and the aqua lance, and which does crushing and works with the high tide. You'll use that on both, and the bubble for my shield. Now I'll swap out either Call of the Deep or maybe Whirlpool for running a supercharge. Each one works differently, just depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish. Now, your big thing is Drown because that gives you your crushing damage, and it has a nice little control feature as well. The water spouts knocks multiple enemies up into the air, so that's nice. The ebb and flow will do good bit of damage, but they will pull to you and then push them away, so that can be useful. Tsunami Strikes is your spam power because you're just going to go bam, bam, bam with that. Aqualance is kind of like your big hitter, and with the high tide it'll do damage over time as well. Now here Steve Trevor gets an early beam off on me because I wasn't paying attention, but I had my bubble up, so it didn't really hurt me too much. But otherwise I really didn't have too much trouble with him. Now with this character I'm using the event version of the solo, so it's not quite like I was at tier, but as I showed you, she doesn't have a whole lot of skill points, and her artifacts are at like 20 or 39 or something like that. They're not very strong at all. Water is not one of my most played powers, so it doesn't get as much attention as some of my others. Now when you're doing this solo, I found it's very useful to stay up in the air against Steve Trevor, so you don't have, or the Hive guy is your, depending on which faction, so you don't have to worry about getting snagged by that stupid beam. Now against Lobo, still using the same kind of thing. As always, you want to get into a corner so you don't have to worry about that. Is a little fire-breathing motorcycle. The Aqua Lance gives good steady damage. Tsunami is your good strong range spam power. You don't really want to do ebb on a boss, probably, because you don't necessarily want to have them pulled right to you. But the water spouts does affect bosses, not always, but it did hit him and Steve Trevor, and if it didn't push him up in the air, it did kind of throw him off for a little bit. Not as well as Drown. Drown has a really good effect for that with the choking, as you can see. But with both bosses, I didn't really have any problems. The power worked just fine. Now, the high tide version of this power, you may have seen if you look at on Google and do searches. There's a particular website that sort of a blog and sort of a guide, and it has a lot of tips for the powers. And some of those powers, the tips I've liked and some not, but I do like to check back on it to see just what they're currently suggesting. And I was kind of surprised that when they looked at water, their loadout for it was very similar to mine. The only real difference I'm going to make here is I'm going to take the water spouts out and put in high tide. Now the key with high tide is you have high tide up, but most all the powers that utilize high tide take it back away, like the Aqualance, which does good damage, but it removes high tide, and high tide takes a while to cycle, so you use Tsunami Strikes with the tap range to go boom, 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 and each strike reduces the cooldown by 4 seconds, which is handy because it's a 30-second cooldown. So otherwise it wouldn't be that practical, but you've got to get the Tsunami Strikes off, and you have to be comfortable using them. So again, you start with Drown, get your High Tide and Aqua Lance going. I tend to, as soon as I have High Tide up, I'll hit the Aqua Lance and then start hitting them with the Tsunami Strikes to get that recycling going back. And then I'll just use the ebb and flow as needed depending on the type of group that I'm up against. Now I found both loadouts to be very similarly effective. When I did these runs, the time on the boss fights was almost identical on both. I think I was just a few seconds faster on Lobo with the High Tide, but not enough to really make a huge difference. That might have been because I actually remembered to use my Supercharge, which I did not on the first run. Again, trying to stay up in the air to avoid that nasty beam. Now the Ebb power and the Tsunami Strike, as well as the Aqua Lance, all hit multiple targets. The Tsunami Strike might not seem that way at first, but it does hit the multiple targets, so that's very useful. And I really like the Drown power with water. That's probably one of my favorite actual powers because it has a good control effect. A lot of times the supercharged generating power or power interaction power doesn't necessarily have a good control effect. But the way Drown does, where they got the bubble over their head and they suddenly start choking, holding their throats, is a great way to slow things down and get them on their back feet so you can throw other powers at them. Now, one thing in looking at this video that just kind of annoys me, but I have to laugh at it, is, as I have said in other videos, I am horrible about remembering to use my trinket. And that is about the only button that never gets pushed in this whole fight is actually using the trinket. I do recommend you use your trinket. It winds up actually being real helpful when you need a little extra might and whatever else. Oh, I did use the trinket. Good. Wind will be so proud of me. Now again, keeping in the corner is a really good tactic for fighting Lobo. I have noticed that there's times that Superman will get Lobo backed into a corner, and that works out really well also because if you get him back into that corner, then he just gets kind of stuck in there and can't go anywhere, which is quite handy when you just stand off at range and throw stuff at him. But if you're on this side of that post, then the motorcycle hog can't breathe fire on you. So that's pretty much how it goes. Like I said, both runs were very similar. The big difference for me is I like the water spouts. I like the control aspect it does. But if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. And as always, happy gaming.